Hi, hello everybody. My name is Sandra, child and family therapist at the Assessment Directed Therapy Program here at Boost Child and Youth Advocacy Center. Welcome. This is the first time that I'm doing a presentation in this forum, so I'm excited. It is a little bit odd that I cannot see your faces, but I think we'll do good. So we're going to spend some time together today, and I'm going to talk about understanding trauma from a developmental perspective. And to understand what trauma does, we need to first understand what trauma is. And I'm sure that many of you will be very familiar with the next couple of references and quotes. So the National Child Traumatic Stress Network defines trauma as an event or series of events that involve fear or threat. I really like because it really captures the complexity. Oops, just a second, sorry, we are doing something here. Let's start from the beginning. Okay. Okay, we are back. All right. So trauma is the unique individual experience of an event or enduring conditions in which the individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed, and the individual experiences either objectively or subjectively, and I think this is really important to emphasize, her life, bodily integrity, or that of a caregiver or a family. So it can be equally traumatizing for a child to witness family members go through difficult experiences, of course. Traumatic events are external, but quickly become incorporated into the mind, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And also traumatization occurs when both internal and external resources, for many reasons, are inadequate to cope with external threats. So we human beings, we inhabit different bodies, right? We have a physical body, emotional body, cognitive or mental body. And we function the best when those pieces are integrated into one whole, okay? So that's how we are physiologically cued. There are many factors, individual factors, family factors, community factors, which really promote that wholeness and resiliency. For example, some of the individual factors might be individual's temperament or relationship to oneself or opportunities to express oneself. Or family factors might be relationships within a family, presence of role models, or, for example, stability and safety of the family, as well as community factors such as neighborhood cohesion or school or access to services. What we see day in and day out is that the most important protective resource to enable a child to cope with exposure to violence or abuse is a strong relationship with a competent, caring, positive adult, which is most often a parent. As you might know, children do not have the option to report, move away, or otherwise protect themselves. They are pretty much dependent on their caregivers for their survival. And trauma does not happen in isolation, okay? So traumatic experiences will impact an entire person, the way we think, learn, remember things, how we feel about ourselves and others, and the way we make sense of our world. And because trauma does not happen in vacuum, in isolation, it also impacts not just individual, but a family and very often a community as well. What causes trauma? Many of you know this, but traumatic events can include both experiencing as well as witnessing of the following. It can be a physical abuse, it can be a single act of physical abuse or several acts, domestic violence. Domestic violence is one of the most common forms of violence in society nowadays, and it does not exist solely in female-male relationships. Emotional abuse, oftentimes it's connected, comes together with a. It can be neglect, both emotional or physical, so emotional, physical needs of a child, And if a child does not receive necessary nurturance, then it might impact their growth and development. Sexual abuse or sexual assault, parental mental health issues such as chronic depression, institutionalized parents, suicide attempts, incarcerated, so on. So if there is traumatic events experienced by a caregiver, even before the child was born, they can still impact the child, especially if those issues were not addressed or resolved. Okay, because it is likely then that the distress of a caregiver will override or divert attention away from the child. So the caregiver can really struggle to provide the safe, supportive environment for a child. Next is the community violence, so like shooting, robbery, stabbing. It can be natural disasters, hurricane, fire, flood, traumatic grief, which is a loss of a loved person. Unfortunately, the world we live in has terrorism and refugee trauma as well as witnessing a war or a genocide. Again, it can be experienced or witnessed. So it can be historical because it is part of trauma narrative, and it will impact the future generations. The example is Holocaust, or things or experiences that happen to Native people, right? Such as boarding school and child removal, relocation. What we also know and what studies have shown is that adverse childhood experiences are way more common than acknowledged. And most of they will happen within the context of child's caregiving system. So it's most often from a trusted person or somebody that a family or a child already knew. Trauma can be experienced as a single event, although I will be very honest, I almost cannot recall the last time when I worked with somebody who has gone through a single event. It can be accumulative or strain trauma, which means it's a reoccurring abuse, or it can be health concerns as well. Complex trauma, which is basically a series of different kinds of abuse. It can be, for example, domestic violence, then physical abuse, then emotional abuse, neglect. Starts in early childhood and continues throughout the developmental stages, and of course within the primary caregiver system. And I'll talk really in detail about complex trauma later today. And also it can be a historical or intergenerational trauma. So like I already mentioned, if personal stories of abuse is not resolved, and it's internalized, and then it's passed down from one generation to the next. So I want to talk a little bit about possible layers of complexity, what we really have to keep in mind. So when trauma emanates from within the family, a child, as well as adults, will do anything to organize their life around that traumatic experience. What does that mean? Well, that means that they might be asked, children might be asked to keep secrets. They might be asked to not tell. They might tell or disclose and then see that no action is taken. They can also experience many disruptions in the family relationship. So all of this oftentimes brings this sense of helplessness, and the child can do many different things to try to metabolize and process that. There can be compliance or defiance, right, to accommodate in any way they can to this situation. It is important to emphasize that a child is faced with an exceptional complexity if the family environment itself is responsible for victimization and the child-caregiver relationship becomes the source of trauma. And I will talk about that in a minute. there are different factors that will impact the child's experience of traumatic events. Such factors are the age of onset. We know that infants and toddlers are at a higher risk for abuse because, as we know, and I will talk more about that in a minute, those early years really set the stage for all the coming developmental stages. Also severity of abuse, frequency, duration, extent of injury, as well as the relationship to the offending individual. Trauma always happens in a developmental context. So this is really what we want to spend more time exploring today. So let me talk a little bit about that. So basically from the moment we are born onwards, we're going to go through different developmental stages. Every next stage is nested or held or scaffolded by the previous one. So you can imagine it as a nesting dolls, okay, one fitting into the next. And every certain tasks and goals, and hopefully in a good enough situation, a child has opportunity to master those tasks and integrate it into a whole. Such developmental tasks can be, for example, understanding and managing and tolerating feelings, and regulating and self-soothing. It is also seeing the world as a safe place, or, for example, self-perception, so like the idea of identity. Also trusting others and building relationships, and gathering this capacity to take in, to make meaning, to have organized thinking and decision-making, so like in a goal-oriented way. So what happens if trauma takes place? What happens is that all of a sudden, a child needs to use all of his or her emotional energy, mental, cognitive energy, life energy to process what's going on, to metabolize what's going on, what's happening inside of the child and outside. And therefore, that child is not given the opportunity to work through what he or she would be otherwise working through in that particular developmental stage. Also, oftentimes what happens is that the child is experiencing the traumatic situation, and that traumatic event is oftentimes beyond her age or developmental stage. So in a way, a child is asked to grow up faster. Also important, we're going to move from one developmental stage to the next, regardless of whether we have completed those goals and tasks or not. So you can imagine that when traumatic events happen and attention and life energy is taken elsewhere, we do not have a chance to complete certain stages or some tasks. So if you imagine nesting dolls, then in the wall of those dolls, you might have empty places where tasks were not completed. So if we look at it from the concept of developmental trauma, then that child is at risk for cumulative effect of ongoing failure experiences. Later on in the system, in the mental health system, we can see that as symptoms, okay? Because depending on the age and stage of the onset of trauma, child's brain development and memory and narrative and verbal capacities, all of this will be affected, as well as child's opportunity for recovery. For those children whose traumatic experiences become the norm rather than the exception, these responses to trauma will interfere with or override the process of healthy development. Like already explained, we have to move from one stage to the next regardless. And the consequences of those traumatic events are highly likely to derail the healthy biological, emotional, cognitive, and social development. So those kids may not have a chance to develop coping skills or a sense of self, or a sense of self in a relationship to others. So I know that the topic today is developmental stages and the impact of trauma. And if we had more time, we could actually go from one developmental stage to the next and really explore what are the tasks of each stage and what might be the impact of trauma. I'm going to talk primarily about attachments now, but before I go into that, I want to tell you that there is this website, which you can see on a slide. It's an Australian website. It's really a very good website. I would highly recommend it. If in their search box you type Child Development and Trauma Guide, you're going to get several PDF documents which really trace child development from 0 to 18 and outline each stage and tasks of the stage, as well as possible impacts of trauma, as well as suggestions on how to react in certain situations. So I would highly recommend it for anyone who is working with this population, so with children and family, and also oftentimes I suggest it for caregivers of children who have been through traumatic experiences, because it helps them understand what is going on and bring more insight into it. Okay, so for the next little while, I want to talk a little bit about attachment. And attachment is this story of how I got to be a person. Every single one of us has an attachment story, an attachment style embedded deeply in our being. That attachment style shows up in any relationship that we have. It tells us about how our needs were met or not met. It tells us about what love is, what relationships are, as well as about repair and how we integrated what we learned, or maybe not, right? So I really want to talk a little bit about that. So at a biological level, we are cued for attachment. So genetically, we know that we absolutely need the proximity of a caregiver, most often a parent, and we need that for survival. So what does that mean? So if a child perceives a disturbance, that child will give a sign to the parent to come closer, right? A little cry or something. So it really, attachment describes this bond which develops between a child or an infant and their primary caregiver. It is more than this biological genetic imprint. It's also on the level of the mind or our psychology. So what it means is that a child does not know what emotions are, doesn't know how to self-regulate, doesn't even have a sense of self that early on. So what I need is I need my caregiver's nervous system to intertwine almost with mine as a child and teach me how to regulate, to mirror to me who I am, okay? So this is how it begins to build something we call internal maps. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But we learn all of this not because somebody is telling it to us, or not because, a child is given a tool book, like read this and you will know how to live. We actually experience it, and it happens before any logical thinking takes place, logical thinking that we consider now as adults. So it's more on the emotional level, and everything is at a time when we will actually not remember the first 3 years of our life, but it still stays remembered in ourselves and in our body. There is at the bottom, the book is called The General Theory of Love. I would highly recommend it also to anyone who works with children and families, and just in general. And really, that book explains how this physiology of our relationships and attachment penetrates to the core of who we are, to our nervous system, and what it means. I want to talk a little bit about this concept that was brought by Winnicott. Winnicott was a British psychoanalyst and pediatrician, and he made huge contributions to the whole field of attachment. And he speaks about this X plus Y plus Z. talk a little bit about that. So ideally, in a good enough environment, the child's infancy will contain enough experiences that are nourishing, which means, my needs will be met. There's going to be somebody present there for me when I need that person. And that promotes a sense of going on being, basic trust. So when I experience enough of that in the childhood, how that carries into my adulthood is I'm going to have this deep sense of inner resilience. So let's imagine a scenario that there is a little disturbance and a child experiences this disturbance, and the amount of time X. And after this amount of X, a caregiver comes and soothes the child. So what I learn is, okay, I have the capacity to call, and I have a capacity, you will come if I make that call, and we will go back to regulate and back to going on being and back to repair. In the second scenario, we can imagine X plus Y amount of time that passes. And if X plus Y goes by, and let's say the caregiver still comes and provides support, we can still repair. But sometimes, and especially in the case of trauma, the time of disturbance or the experience, the perception of disturbance goes on for the amount of time of X plus Y plus Z. And maybe nobody comes. The child doesn't have the option to stay in this disturbance. And what the child begins to experience is despair, is I call and nobody comes. There is no repair, okay? In that case, so my internal map will be very different because that gets to be remembered in some way in my psyche, in my nervous system, in my body, okay? And it's not remembered logically. Why is this important, and why is at such an early age so significant? Is that traumatic experience in adults will affect the organized brain. However, in infants and children, it begins to organize the developing brain. And I'm aware that that's a pretty complex statement. I'll talk a little bit more about the nervous system and organization of the nervous system in a minute, so maybe it becomes a bit clearer. What we do know is that the security of attachment bonds will help against traumatic experiences. And what we also know that the more disorganized the parent, the more disorganized the child. So the child is likely to mimic parents' response to traumatic events. And that is really crucial, especially in the field that I'm working in, because so often, more often than not, we will have parents with their own history of trauma and their own ways of responding to it. So we have to take that into account when we work with children. When the people that a child is attached to are also the people in the child, then the children are likely to suffer not only disrupted attachment, but disruption in all other developmental systems. Like I said, attachment, the first phase, really sets the tone for other steps that follow. And then if many critical developmental competencies are disrupted, children become unable to process or integrate what is happening. And remember, I mentioned way at the beginning, function the best, and we are physiologically prepared to function the best as a whole, which is not a case in this scenario. Okay, so what happens after trauma takes place? So during the traumatic experience, parts of our brain, the old brain called reptilian brain, will shift the body. It takes control and shifts body into reaction. Okay, everything that is non-essential will shut it down, and we go into survival mode. So part of our nervous system, which is in charge of action taking and survival, which is called sympathetic nervous system, will increase the stress hormones and really prepare the body for fight, flight, freeze. Or if everything else fails, we might go into faint. If, in everyday normal situation, when the threat is gone, there is a whole other process which allows the nervous system to relax and go into restorative mode. However, for some who experience trauma, this shift from reactive to restorative maybe never occurs. But instead, our reptilian brain, our reactive brain, holds in constant reactive state. Okay, so what does that mean? There are parts of our nervous system, parts of our brain that are implicated in the responses to trauma. For example, amygdala. I'm sure you have probably heard about amygdala. Amygdala is the brain response to threat, fear. Okay, so if I'm in a constant reactive state, that means that my amygdala is stuck on red alert and it's reacting. So anything can be tagged, even if objectively it's not dangerous. So later on, if activated by anything remotely reminiscent of the original event, it can be smell, it can be a color, it can be body movement, okay? The body will react on the inside and begin to replay the story and replay the responses to trauma. Another part of the brain which gets affected is hippocampus. Hippocampus is the part of the brain which decides, does this memory get stored or forgotten? And it's also in charge of the autobiographic memory. When trauma happens, memories are not recorded in the way which they usually are, okay? The memories stay not integrated, we kind of fragment. It doesn't mean that we are not remembering. We are remembering, but those memories are stored in different places and they are disorganized. So what that means that later on, we can be vulnerable to flashbacks, to body memories, to nightmares and reenactments. And this fragmentation which happens protects actually from over. We also go into fragmentation. So what I really want to be like a take-home message here is that it's not just the trauma itself that will, but that it's equally important to begin to understand how individuals' mind and in their own unique ways to traumatic experiences and in combination with the unique responses to the individual's environment, which is family, friends, society, and so on. Like I already mentioned, trauma alters the way the brain works. And there is a huge amount of literature and research on that. Feel free to search and browse. It's pretty amazing. Different reactions to trauma. Here are just some of them listed. What is important to remember that every child is unique. There is many different factors which will influence the range of reactions a child may or may not experience. And children will react differently to trauma than adults. And some possible symptoms, which are fluctuating oftentimes in presentation, are the following. So very common, we hear, teachers or parents or other people involved with the family say, this kid just can't sit still. Okay, so what we see is hyperactivity and constant movement and fidgeting. What might be going on is that trauma causes hypervigilance. So traumatized people are almost always on the outlook for danger, right? So that probably worked back at the time when the traumatic experiences were happening. For example, if move and reading, the signals and cues and knowing when, let's say the person who sexually abused the child is around the house or is about to come to the house, and making sure that I'm constantly out and out of the danger, that maybe kept me safe. Now, in the circumstances which are not anymore, so to speak, dangerous, the staying on the move might be the survival, which is not working anymore. It's not meant to be working, right? But it's there. Another thing that oftentimes we hear is, oh my God, you know, this child is sharing so many stories, and those stories doesn't have to be trauma experience-related stories. It can be any kind of everyday stories. And some stories don't even make sense. And you might even hear people say, you know, this kid is lying, and, you know, this kid is being caught lying. So one thing that we know is, like I already mentioned, is trauma causes gaps in the memory, because the whole body and the nervous system is in this mode of survival, and the whole energy is going elsewhere and keeping me safe. The memory is not being stored in a proper way. But what we do know is that our brain is trying to make sense of things, because that's what feels safe to us. So we need to make things make sense. And when we are missing pieces, our brain will actually fill them in. Again, it's a good survival skill, but gone wrong now. Another possible scenario is that you can see a kid that can't make any friends. And what we see are poor social skills or difficulties in relationships. What we know about trauma is that trauma causes disruptive attachment. So if loving and trusting led me to pain in the past, I will not do it. Mind you, I didn't even emphasize, but most of this is happening unconsciously. So it's not that I'm choosing not to consciously stop doing it. Another scenario is that, which get in a lot of trouble, for example, aggression and fighting. What we know is that trauma causes fight or flight. It's the most basic instinct, right? And maybe it was functioning really well for me way back in a situation, but not anymore. Another possible scenario is that things turn out the other, right? We hear about kids who really have difficulty remembering or retaining any kind of material. And what we know, and what I already described, is that amygdala is on alert. It's constantly on alert for people who had many difficult experiences, and it will keep on tagging things for danger. And only those things that are tagged for danger will be important to attend to. So I don't have much free space, so to speak, to remember other things, to anything else. Many times we see kids that are kind of like tornadoes. They can be even provoking others, and it can be a little bit chaotic. What we know is that when the trauma happens, usually adrenaline kicks in to give us this extra strength and speed. And if we had plenty of such experiences, then our nervous system can stay wound up. It did not get a chance to go back to that restorative, okay? So it can look like this constant search for adrenaline and constant action. Again, survival skill, which helped me back then, but it's not important, or it's not, it should not be going on right now. But for me, I'm perceiving it as necessary at all the time. And finally, you know, you can see a lot of kids that are described as kids having behavioral problems. Nothing takes, like it doesn't take anything to set him or her off. There is irritability, hyperarousal, dysregulation of affect, and so on. What we do know in trauma work is that trauma can result in flashbacks. And because memory is stored in different parts of our brain and even in our body, this child may actually be experiencing flashbacks and reacting to something which is actually not happening in the present real moment. But for the body on the inside, it feels like now. And it feels like back in the time when the trauma was taking place. Okay, so this is just a list of various other additional common reactions to trauma that we come across. So nightmares, physical symptoms such as difficulty sleeping, eating, headaches, stomach aches, lowered immune system, disruption in toilet training, or going back to wetting. As I already said, hypervigilance, so this chronic physical arousal, hypersensitivity, so responding as if there is threat to life all the time, difficulty concentrating, dissociation. So for example, some children as well as young adults can notice themselves kind of go elsewhere in their mind. Of course, in their body, they're still present with me in the room. And that can happen pretty unconsciously. They might not be actually aware of it, or they might be aware of it. For example, I worked with a young woman, and in our assessment, we use scrapbooks. And usually teens tend to fill in the scrapbook questions themselves. But this young lady, she asked me to do it. And first I was like, why would I be doing it? But okay, I kept my mind open. And as we got to know each other, she told me that for about 20 to 30% of the time, she's not there with me. She's otherwise somewhere else. And that's the reason why she could not fill the questions in the scrapbook, because she felt she's not there. So that gave them the whole other meaning to what was going on for her. And it was important for me to know. So it's just important, I think, to stay curious. Avoidance is a big way, big common way to react. So staying away from places, people, and things that normally remind us of the traumatic event. Common is also isolation, intense fear and worrying, anger. Anger is a big one. And I mean, what better way against helplessness or hopelessness than being angry? It's a great surge of energy. It gives me this idea that I might be in control unconsciously. I'm not saying that a person is consciously aware of this process. The flip side to that is if this is a child that went through, let's say, domestic violence or physical abuse, and let's say heard from family members or others that he or she is just like the offending individual, then that gives another complexity to this reaction. There's also intense sadness, flashbacks, so when seeing, hearing, smelling something that reminds one about the experience. It can be reenactment. Oftentimes, also with younger kids, they show us things that happen through their play. Alexithymia, which is having no words. And I mean, we are oftentimes at loss for words, for feelings around what was going on during the trauma. And silence, or loss of acquired communication skills. We have to be also extra careful around silence, because silence can sometimes be misinterpreted as resilience, which in fact it's very different than resilience. Younger children are more likely to exhibit more somatic symptoms. They might have separation anxiety. They might have sexualized behaviors or behavior at home or school, ADHD-like symptoms or dissociation. While adolescents are more likely to show problems in conduct, substance misuse, school problems, risky behaviors, running away, self-harm and self-injury, depression, dissociation, as well as somatic symptoms. All of those reactions are normal and common reactions to distressing or difficult experiences, and they become a concern when they begin to impact the daily functioning of children and youth. And most likely they will, especially if they're not getting support and and health. So like I already mentioned, those post-traumatic memories and emotions and sensations and perception of oneself, of others in the world, become in a way stuck in the parts of our nervous system and in those fragmented, not me states. Those states are vulnerable to triggering in any perceived threat. So it can be even remotely similar to what was previously going on in that kid's life or anything that a child is perceiving as threat. And then when activated, these states often involve developmentally younger coping or younger behavior and younger emotional expression. For example, I worked with a young adolescent, and she has been through many difficult experiences earlier in her life. So anytime when we came remotely close to the topic of the early childhood or things that might be triggering, her whole voice changed. It was a voice of a younger child, and she would oftentimes start rocking her body, which is one of the self-soothing mechanisms. And she was not at all aware of that. She wasn't aware of her changing voice, and she was not aware of the rocking. So you can imagine that the more increased complexity of trauma, the more increased complexity of adaptation as a result. So what I want to spend the next little bit talking about is the complex trauma. So the complex trauma, as I already mentioned at the beginning of our time today, involves usually simultaneous or sequential occurrence of different child abuse. It can be psychological maltreatment, neglect, physical and sexual abuse, domestic violence. And usually it's chronic and begins in early childhood and occurs within the primary caregiving system. That exposure to those initial traumatic experiences and then resulting emotional dysregulation, loss of safety, loss of direction, and the ability to detect or respond to danger cues can set up a chain of events leading to subsequent or repeated trauma exposure in adolescence and adulthood. There was a webinar earlier this year in January by Helen Vozinidis from Boost, and she spoke a lot about what it means to be trauma-informed organization, and she spoke a lot about the ACE study, so it's Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So I will not go into detail here. Feel free to go back and listen to Helen's webinar, which is fantastic. So what I want to say here is that Felipe and his colleagues in the States, they've done a huge research on many people in their adulthood, and they asked them about adverse childhood experiences that happened earlier in their life. And what they have noticed is that if you had, for those people who had one adverse childhood experience, there is 80% likelihood of exposure to another. Okay, so I think that is big. And if you have more adverse childhood experiences, so the more experiences, the exponential, the risk grows exponentially for additional, as well as what was also showing is that there is a strong association between the early childhood experiences of trauma with high-risk health behaviors later on in life, such as smoking, alcohol, drug misuse, obesity, suicide attempts, as well as heart disease, cancer, stroke, and diabetes. So I think we really have to be careful and very mindful about all of those factors when talking about complex trauma. Here is a list of all the different layers that complex trauma will affect. So complex trauma can affect attachment. As you already know, and you heard from me today, attachment is this cornerstone of childhood development. So if I have struggles at that level, I will have boundary problems. I might suffer from social isolation. I'm going to have difficulty trusting, and so on. My biology will be affected. So The arousal system is dysregulated. There are problems with coordination and balance, somatization, oftentimes increased medical problems, and so on. Affect regulation will be affected too. So, which means I might struggle to name and experience, identify, express, or modulate my emotions. Behavioral control will be affected. There might be too much inhibition or not enough inhibition. So poor impulse control, it can be self-destructive, it can be aggressive. Cognition will be affected. So I might struggle with paying attention. I'll have problems processing information. I'll have problems social self-concept, so the concept of oneself, which is oftentimes highly, highly negative, and it involves shame and guilt. So I want to talk to you a little bit about a case example. It's a young male, young adult, that I worked with, and he was referred to our agency at the age of 18. He was referred because of the chronic sexual abuse that he disclosed at 17 years. The abuse was going on for 10 years at that time, so started at 7, and included him, but also his siblings. And it was very, very extensive. He also had a family history of sexual abuse, of domestic violence, and he witnessed physical abuse. He had gone through numerous life transitions and many instabilities, so he changed many homes and schools across the country. He also had a history of being bullied. He was mugged, and he had a very scary surgical procedure done after he was bitten in the face by a dog. However, he did not score positive for PTSD. So when we started working, he was not PTSD symptomology. What we did see is his avoidance, his inability to sleep. He had debilitating panic attacks. He had health problems and many unexplainable physical pain. What we also saw is struggles with trust. He struggled with anyone in authority. He suffered from completing or following up. He really struggled. He was reenacting things. He had some poor boundaries, some risky behavior, a lot of struggles with self-esteem and self-worth. He struggled with relationships, both friendships and romantic ones. And he was feeling he does not belong. And I also wanted to tell you other things that we saw to kind of balance it out. So there was this huge courage that he had. He was very honest. He was creative, and creativity literally kept him alive. He had a support of his family, very intelligent, had a very positive outlook, friendly. He had hope and desire to live, and he was very much engaged and wanted the treatment.
They're all strengths.
Yeah, all the strengths. So what we know is that a DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, has one diagnosis which specifically identifies trauma, which is the PTSD. So if we rely just on DSM, as I said, this client did not score positive for PTSD. So what does that mean? So perhaps at this time he's not scoring positive for the PTSD because at this his family is involved in his treatment and family is receiving family treatment as well. And family members have been receiving their own support. The offender is not living at home and the secret is finally out. The real test for this young person is when he moves out, when he starts living on his own, when he has to look for a job. Can he maintain a job? Can he find relationships that are supportive, that are sustainable? What happens for him when he's overwhelmed? What happens if there are authority at work, right? What happens if he has to collaborate with others? So here at Boost, at assessment-directed therapy, our model is informed by DSM, but we also really look into many confluencing factors and the complexity of the full trauma picture. So what we see is the most overlap, but is not necessarily fully captured by PTSD definition, particularly as we look at children. Oftentimes we see children and youth who come and present multi-symptom clinical presentations. So they might be diagnosed depressed, or anxious, or ADHD, or borderline, or suicidal. You might hear that they are seeking attention, quote unquote, or unable to complete tasks, or procrastinating. So what we actually see is somebody who is more or less adult in chronology, but lacking in developmental capacities and external supports to thrive. So the last piece that I want to tell you about a little bit, this is about ways in which complex trauma might intersect with some other diagnoses. And this is from a paper of DeAndrea. It's from Bessel van der Kolk's group. And I want to really point out that, I mean, it's a little bit out of my scope in the sense that I do not diagnose PTSD or ADHD or bipolar. But I really would like to bring your curiosity to look behind the surface, because I think it's really important for those of us who work with complex trauma, and to look at this complexity and ways in which trauma can intersect with some other mental health issues. So for example, the diagnosis that shares the most overlap trauma is PTSD. And as you can see here in the slide, both complex trauma, which is here represented with CT, has hyperarousal, just like PTSD, and interpersonal difficulties, just like PTSD. But the way that complex trauma has it different is that here hyperarousal is about impulse dysregulation, is about risky behaviors, it's about hypervigilance. All of that as an attempt, usually unconsciously, at self-soothing. So it's a little bit different than PTSD alone. The interpersonal difficulties in the case of complex trauma are also here because of long-standing insecure attachment and perceiving others as in a negative light or as a threat. Okay, so it's again a little bit different than interpersonal difficulties in PTSD. Another diagnosis that shares some overlap with complex trauma is ADHD. So the importance here is that in complex trauma, we have chronic dissociation. So in ADHD, you have inattention, which is deficit in focus. In complex trauma, there is a dissociation, so breaks with reality and depersonalization. And we have risk-taking, which is different than hyperactivity, and other ways, again, as an attempt to self-soothe in case of complex trauma. And then there is the poor self-esteem and negative expectations of others. And it can go very quickly from hyperaroused to flat in complex trauma, which is different than ADHD. And then finally, another diagnosis which overlaps is the bipolar. So in the case of bipolar, you have the cycling of impulsivity and depression. So you have the impulsivity, affect dysregulation, and then depression, so manic or depressed. In complex trauma, you have impulsivity again with an attempt to reduce tension. And depression here is about fragmentation and dissociation. It's not necessarily mood related. So it has a different stemming. And there are no manic states. There is no grandiosity when it comes to complex trauma. If anything, there is sense of self as damaged. So I would highly recommend you to have a look at this paper if you are interested in ways how complex trauma can intersect with some other diagnoses and how it can be maybe misleading. And we have to be very careful and open-minded when working with all those complex layers. So in the last part, I want to talk a little bit about how do we approach treatment when we want to talk about trauma and different developmental stages and what happens. So it's really, this is a quote from a paper by Sandra. It's really shifting from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, really understanding multiple layers and difficulties that young people are coming to us about. So at the center of our work, oftentimes, at least in our case, and I'm sure for everybody else, you will see children and youth and their families, and they might be coming to you for the first time to talk about experiences that were one of the worst and most difficult experiences in their life. So really, at the core of our work is how to create a safe space so that children and youth can look at those traumatic experiences and begin to make sense of something which is very difficult to make sense of, but at least make sense of their emotional and mental, logical, and physical reactions and help them find ways to cope. It is important, very important, to bear in mind that children and youth will come to us with different histories, different experiences, very unique family systems and cultural norms and expectations. And all of this will impact their understanding and the meaning that they will make from their abuse experiences. So to have interventions that are effective, we have to pay attention to stage, developmental stage, not necessarily age. To be mindful of what might be the earliest coping mechanism, because the children and youth are likely to revert to whatever is the earliest at the time of when traumatic experiences happen. To know that impact of childhood maltreatment can be delayed, and to really begin to link developmentally the symptoms and what happened in the So, for example, I'm just thinking of a young boy that I'm working with. Because he went through abusive experiences, trauma experiences very early, although now he's 10 and he should, quote unquote, have the language to tell me what went on, he actually doesn't. And because at the time when things were going on, it was not the time of logical thinking, and he was way younger. So the way we are making sense now is we are creating the story not necessarily from the words that he knows from the inside, but we might use, for example, wooden blocks with words, and he might begin to create a story with wooden blocks. Or we might use pictures, because for children sometimes pictures are easier, or we might do it through play. So deepening our understanding of the context of trauma and the complexity of impact which trauma has on children and youth and families can provide us with a very powerful platform when working with adverse events that our clients bring forth. And the therapeutic and child welfare context is oftentimes, like I said, the first possibility for some secure connection to be experienced. I have here a quote by John Briere, which really captures for me what might be the most important thing when it comes to working with children and youth, which is that abuse-focused therapy suggests that a client is not mentally ill or suffering from a defect, but rather is an individual whose life has been shaped in part by ongoing adaptation to toxic environment. Thus, the goal of therapy is less the survivor's recovery than his or her continued growth and development, an approach that utilizes the survivor's already existing skills to move beyond his or her current level of adapting functioning. And in closing, I want to share with you this art piece, which a young woman that I worked with, and when she made it, she was 18, she's 24 now. And she has created this dragon and said, this dragon is a good representation of who I am and who I will become. I hope you can see that there are little scales, golden scales. Every single scale was individually made and created finally this dragon. So this was her healing journey. We literally went scale by scale and worked for a very good amount of time. And the dragon, golden dragon, was born as a symbol of her strength and power. And with that, I want to thank everybody for your time. And this is my contact information. And there are also there is a list of references at the end. And I don't know if we have any questions. So I just want to thank everybody for your time, and I wish you an amazing day, and take care. Bye for now.